and or mute your computer and kill your screen. So without further ado, Dan Donato.
Cool. Thanks, Will. Can you guys see the screen okay? My PowerPoint?
I can, and if someone else is having trouble, send a message, please.
Okay, I'll assume it's all is well unless I hear otherwise. Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for joining. Yeah, like Will said, this was one of the least fun times I ever had being correct, but it is a pretty interesting story to delve into. So yeah, I'll be talking about the last year's Labor Day fires, the big fire event in Western Oregon and Washington, and thinking about the degree to which they were really unprecedented. They were a new experience for most of us, and if not all of us, but there's actually some interesting context to get into. A little bit about who I am. I study what I call mayhem in the forest of all flavors. We call them disturbances, windstorms, insect outbreaks, wildfires, and kind of how forests develop after those kinds of events. I've been doing that in the Pacific Northwest for about 25 years. And incidentally, I'm also involved a bit in wildland firefighting. That's me in the lower left photo there as part of a type 2 firefighting crew. I still do that a bit, and I was actually deployed to the 2020 fires. So I have some academic experience with this kind of stuff and also in the trenches. To get into the 2020 Labor Day fires specifically, I mean, they were quite an event, as I'm sure all of you living in Western Oregon know. It really felt like the entire western part of the state was going up in flames in a mere, 36-hour period. And just to lend kind of a human personal note to this, I'm from this area originally, and a lot of my close family was on various levels of evacuation notice, and these are the landscapes of my childhood. So in a lot of ways, this was my reaction when the 2020 fires were burning. Is I sort of took off the scientist hat, and I didn't feel like sciencing about it because I was right there with probably all of you, kind of feeling the apocalypse of it. But I just kind of wanted to lend that human perspective to it, because for the rest of the talk, I'm going to take kind of a detached, scientific perspective on things, and delving into, the ways the natural world works and our relationship to it, kind of the cold hard truths of it, but also fascinating truths. So one of the things that you heard thrown around a lot about the 2020 fires was the word unprecedented, and that it was a new level of destruction, and this could be the beginning of something. And what I'm going to show you today is that in some pretty important ways, those perspectives are actually wrong. And also, there was a whole series of kind of reactions to the Labor Day fires that touched on a lot of forest hot stone topics, like were these fires a result of too much logging or not enough logging? Were they driven by climate change? Do we need to go in and post-fire log and do a lot of rehabilitation activities to get these forest ecosystems back? And you see various headlines that touch on these topics. And what I'm going to show you today will also show you that most of these perspectives are incorrect as well. So I'm going to zoom out to start, and this is a map showing burn footprints in Washington state. So appreciate that I now work in Washington state, so a lot of my research and focus happens to be there, but I could show a similar map for Oregon, especially the northern half of Oregon. So I appreciate that when I'm talking about things from Washington, I'm also talking about northern Oregon, northwest Oregon. And so you'll notice a couple things on this map. One is that the fires are very concentrated on the east side of the Cascade Crest. And I want to talk about the east side for just a second, because there's a narrative there that I'm betting all of you are familiar with. The east side is drier, as you all know, and therefore it's not as productive a forest, just biomass grows more slowly there. And so what we have is fires tend to be limited by the amount of fuel that's there, because it doesn't grow into as dense a forest on the east side as it does on the west side. And if you let that forest, do its thing for 80 years without fire suppression and periodic frequent fires, because we know fire is pretty frequent in the dry forest on the east side, those frequent fires tend to clean out fuels and regeneration and kind of keep the forest in an open, fuel limited state. Whereas if you suppress fires for an 80-year period, like we have for the past 80 plus years, that excludes the flame, which lets the forest kind of densify by not clearing out that regeneration. And you transform the forest into something different that's dominated by these smaller fire sensitive trees, and it can choke out the larger fire resistant trees, and it really can alter the way fires burn over there. And that's a common narrative. You probably all heard that fire suppression has caused this issue on the east side. It's a forest health issue now, and we've really changed the way fires burn there. Now, what I want to emphasize and go through in much of the rest of this talk is if you walk away with nothing else from this talk, I want you to walk away with the idea that the west side is completely different, and that narrative that we're used to from the east side and the way fire and fuels work there, for the most part, does not apply on the west side. We really need to think differently for the west side. So just going back to the map, you can see there's almost like a firewall at the top of this, or along the Cascade Crest, where fires have just been extremely rare in the last 25 years on the west side, up till 2020. And so it's not that fires don't occur there at all. So this map that we're looking at here is a map of what we call fire regimes, which is a fancy way of saying how often fires burn in an area and how severely they burn when they do. And so you can see the east side of the crest, which is kind of that narrow strip on the eastern edge there, is dominated by the red and tan kind of frequent low to mixed severity fires. And then on the west side, especially in Northwest Oregon through Washington, we tend to be dominated by these moderately frequent to infrequent mixed to high severity. And a lot of the area that we'll be talking about today is really in that black zone, where fires are really quite rare, but when they do burn, they tend to burn severely. And because fires are so rare in that zone, and we've only really inhabited, post-European settlement, we've only inhabited this landscape for 100, 200 years. We just haven't had that much experience with fires, and we haven't been able to collect very much data on it. So in some ways, the color of that zone is apt in being black. It's a bit of a black box. There's a lot we don't know about fires in that area just because we just haven't been able to collect much data on them yet. But I'll walk you through some things we do know. I'm gonna make sure my PowerPoint is working okay here. Okay. So it's interesting. So we've been giving variations of this talk and doing studies on this long before the big fires of last year. And interested stakeholders and managers and so on were asking us about Westside fires. How frequent can we expect them to be? How big can we expect them to get? And what impacts can we expect them to have? And so also interestingly, we started this question from a completely different angle, which was we wanted to know historically how much old growth likely existed on the landscape, which is a totally separate question that relates to sort of habitat management, supporting species of concern that are associated with old forests. But the first thing you have to know, one of the first things you have to know to answer the question of how much old growth was on the landscape in the past is you have to know about the thing that eats old growth, and that is big fires. And so we had to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the literature on fires on the west side to learn some things about how often they burned exactly and how big they were. And we actually just recently published a paper on this. I just wanted to highlight that this is available if you really wanted to nerd out on this. I think Will might be posting this for anyone interested. So to kind of simplify the life cycle of a Douglas-fir hemlock forest on the west side of the Cascade Crest or in the Coast Range, You can kind of consider it a basic cycle of born in fire and then matures through various stages of development toward old growth. And then on the order of a few centuries, a few to several centuries, it'll burn again and start over. So the landscapes we know of the west side that are green and verdant and lush, they all have that history. This happens to be one of my favorite landscapes in the southern Washington Cascades. That's Mount Mitchell in the foreground and Mount St. Helens in the background, and the Susan drainage. And if I zoom into that picture at the top, you'll notice that there's a couple of different patches. I hope this is clear on your screens as it is on mine, but there's some distinct textures to the canopy. In the foreground, there's a really rough textured old growth forest. In the middle ground, there's kind of a smooth textured younger forest. And in the background, there's another patch of that rough textured old growth forest. And what we're looking at there, if you have the right eye, are old burn footprints. And so back in the day, these forests started looking like this. And it's always nice to always good to have that reminder that that's the way these forests are born and start. And so this is a picture of the 2017 Eagle Creek fire in the Columbia Gorge. So this is just kind of West Side fires doing the West Side fire thing, blowing out patches of stand replacement. Just pretty much consistent with everything we would expect them to do. So we basically went back to this life cycle model and made it into a simulation model that grew forests over a certain time and then burned them with certain frequency. But we had to solve some equations about the fires, and that's what I want to focus on here. We had to answer this question: how big were the largest fire episodes? And so I'm going to walk you through kind of some basic math, which I know is always a little dangerous, but this tends to work well for folks. So I'm going to use the example of the West Cascades of Washington. If you would like, we can replace it with the Coast Range of Oregon. It would be the same sort of math concept. So this landscape is 6 million acres. We know that what we call the fire rotation, which is the time it takes on average for that entire landscape to experience fire, is about 500 years. So, and those are pretty good numbers from the literature. That's one of the things we do know. So if I ask a question and say, if we know the whole thing burns on average every 500 years, but there's only one fire in that every 500 years, how big does that fire have to be? Pretty simple math, right? It's got to be one giant 6 million acre fire happening every 500 years on average. Okay, next step. What if there's two fires for every 500 year interval? So it would have to be two fires of 3 million acres in size to add up to the 6 million over that 500 year period. Pretty simple math. Take a few steps ahead. What if there's 5 fires every 500 years? So now we're looking at 100-year intervals on average. Same algebra equation, with the average fire size would still have to be 1.2 million acres. Now, we know we're getting in the ballpark, right? Because fire on the west side is pretty rare, and it tends to reoccur at intervals in that ballpark. Let's just jump ahead and just do a what if exercise and go way ahead and say, what if there's 20 fires every 500 years? So now there's a major fire happening in the West Cascades on the west side every 25 years, which is really frequent, right? And it would still, the average fire size would still have to be 300,000 acres, which is an enormous fire. That's about a third of the area that burned in the 2020 fires. So this would be extremely newsworthy fires happening every 25 years. And that's really kind of trying to break the model. So what I'm trying to convince you by showing this is there's not really any voodoo to the idea that from what we know about West Side fires, they pretty much have to be large just to sort of solve the math equation. And one thing I want to emphasize here is that would be the average fire size, right? There would be variation, of course, around this. Some fires would be smaller and larger than others. And so that would be taking this kind of look at it. It's sort of like the bell curve that we're all familiar with, the mean fire size and some variation around that. But that's actually not really how the universe tends to work in terms of most phenomena. And instead, it works a little more sophisticated like, and I want to walk you through this because it's kind of an important concept for how we think about Westside fires. So think about any event. Let's take a dust devil in the desert. When you're driving, on the highway there, you see lots of these little dust devils on a hot day, right? They're pretty, you see one maybe once a day or more. And then a medium-sized one you might see pretty rarely, but occasionally, maybe, every several drives you take through the desert. And then very rarely you'll see a giant one. And if you draw a line through those, this is the shape you get. And that's called a negative exponential curve. And that describes the distribution of almost all natural phenomena. And you're actually familiar with this from lots of concepts like city populations. So there tends to be lots of small towns and only a few large cities in each state, right? Distributed along the same curves. Earthquakes are distributed that way. And I've recently added pandemics to that list, where you can all appreciate that virtually every year we have a flu season that's kind of average or small. Maybe every 10 years or so, we might have kind of a bad flu season. And then about once a century, apparently, judging by the 1918 Spanish flu and now this recent one, about once a century, we get like a global pandemic kind of virus. So lots of things are distributed along this curve. Why am I showing a flood while I'm talking about estimating maximum fire size? Because another example you are all likely familiar with is the way we describe floods, even in the popular media, where when a flood event happens, you'll hear, oh, that was a 100-year flood, that was a 50-year flood. They don't even have to explain it to you. You just know when you hear that the frequent ones are the smaller ones and the rare ones are the really big ones. And this is a map of flooding extent, predicted flooding extent for a 100-year flood versus a 500-year flood. And fires are no different than this. So what we did was basically solve that algebra equation, that simple math equation that I walked you through, but just in a slightly more sophisticated way, trying to find the tip of that exponential curve. And so this is a table of event types, say like a 25-year fire, a 50-year fire, the 100-year fire. And we just solved the equation for that. And from the best estimates that we could derive from the literature, these are the numbers that we came up with, that those 25 to 50-year events tend to be on the small side, but still, tens to 100,000 acres. And that would be like the Eagle Creek fire that burned in 2017 in the Columbia Gorge. And then the Labor Day fires fall pretty squarely in our estimates of the 100-year to 200-year events. I think around 1 million acres burned in that single year in Western Oregon. So it's right in that ballpark. So delving into that just a little further, because fires on the west side are such a black box, and there's not that much published information on it, we kind of wanted to play some what if scenarios, like what if those estimates are wrong in one direction? What if they're wrong in the other direction? And so we took this life cycle with that rotation that I told you about, so that 500-year rotation-ish, and said, well, what if it's actually 200 years? What if it's 600 years? Or I can't remember the numbers we used, but we really tried to break the model and go and capture anything that the literature could possibly support. And then also with that second part of the equation I showed you, what if fires are really rare but big, or what if fires are actually really frequent but small? And we had to kind of play with dial both of those knobs until we kind of came up with different combinations that we really tried to break the model and say, well, what is the range of estimates for how big fires could be in Western Oregon and Washington? And so that 200-year event I showed you from the earlier table is repeated here in the middle as our best estimate. 1.7 million acres would be the maximum fire size that we would expect. But we solved this equation 9 different ways, and no matter how we solved it, you can appreciate by looking at this table that there's just a lot of zeros. No matter how much we tried to break the sort of math equation, there's no way to solve for how fires work on the west side without there being really large fire events. And we did all this, again, well before 2020, and we were sort of on the road telling people this, and we had a lot of sort of disbelief in the audiences, which I'll talk about more in a minute. As a scientist, when you get numbers this big, it's always nice to get some confirmation that you're not completely out in left field. And So you dig through the literature a bit, and in fact, there's some estimates of events in the past that are of similar scale, like a 1700 fire episode that burned over 1 million acres on the Olympic Peninsula near the coast, and several million acres across western Washington. The Yakult burn in southwest Washington was estimated to be upwards of 1 million acres. And a lot of you know the Tillamook burn, which is not far from your neck of the woods, burned several 100,000 acres in the 1930s. And just some visual images of those, the aftermath of the Yakult burn in southwest Washington, and then the actual active burning of the Tillamook burn taken from an airplane. Those were major events that actually had striking parallels to the 2020 fires, which I'll talk about more in a minute. Another line of evidence about the precedence of really large fires on the west side. So this is that fire regime map again. At the turn of the 20th century, during the settlement era, the government sent out land surveyors to survey the mountains and report and map the vegetation in the forest landscape that was there. And they indicated areas that were burned over. And that's those pink crosshatched areas. And you can see it's actually a pretty big extent at that time. And they mapped the largest patch size then. The largest single fire patch was over 1 million acres in that snapshot that was taken right around 1900. And there were at least 5 patches that were over 250,000 acres. So another similar piece of evidence that's kind of consistent with the 2020 fires. So I'll shift gears for a little bit here now. And when we walk people through that, wow, okay, you can expect some really mega fires on the west side. A natural first question is, how the heck does that happen? And near as we can tell, there's a 3-part recipe for west side fires. The first one is an exceptional degree of summer drought. And it does seem to be that these fires tend to correlate with not just an average summer drought, because we always have a summer dry season, but typically in an exceptionally droughty summer. We had one in 2015, but we didn't get the ignitions in the wind event. And then 2020, we had all the ingredients. So you have to have an ignition on the landscape. And the third one is the big one that we had in 2020, where all the stars aligned and we had what we call a synoptic east wind event. It's a region scale high pressure system that sits inside the Cascades on the east side and blows hot, dry winds, warm, dry winds over the Cascade crest and down the valleys. And they can, gust over 50 miles an hour. And that's really the big thing that turns these small ignitions that are just kind of skunking around on the landscape that we have almost every season, and that blows them up into these really mega fires. And they tend to do it over a very short period, 1 to 3 days. So these were stats that we showed before the 2020 fires that seemed to really wow people, but now we've actually experienced it in real time. The Tillamook burn, 200,000 of the acres that burned in the Tillamook burn did so in a single 24-hour period. And the Yakult burn marched 30 miles in a single 36-hour period, which is pretty mind-blowing. This is a map showing the Tillamook burn, what we call a progression map, which is the different colors are just what burned on different days. And you can see it spent several days kind of in that small area in the eastern portion of the fire. And then overnight on August 25th, it just burned almost the entire rest of the perimeter. So that's kind of the MO for how Westside fires do their thing, the biggest ones. Interestingly, this actually has quite a bit of parallel with the fires we tend to read about almost every year from California, the fires that are driven by Santa Ana winds. Similar meteorological phenomenon. The only difference really is that California gets theirs virtually annually, and we get ours pretty infrequently. Otherwise, it's the same concept. And one way I like to try and get this message across to people is to not think of Westside fires, the big ones, so much as a fire event per se, and more of really a wind event that has fire in it. And that actually has some really important implications for how we manage the risk of these events, what we can do about them, and how we need to prepare for them. I'll circle back to that. And like a lot of things these days, there's no new ideas. There were voices in the wilderness telling us this, 60, 70 years ago, where they figured out that fires on the west side tend to occur when there's these severe easterly winds. This was back in the 1950s, an old meteorological report. And we also have data on this now. So this is just a plot of the number of east wind days that we experience on the west side. And you can see for the most part, east winds are concentrated in the winter. So they're not really a concern for most of the fire season, June, July, and well into August. But there's a little window right at the end of the summer where we're still in fire season. It hasn't really started raining yet. And the east wind events start to pick up. And so again, the 2020 fires being called the Labor Day fires is entirely consistent with this pattern and all of the historical fires. The Tillamook burn was in late August. The Yakult burn was I think on September 10th or 11th of 1902, where the Labor Day fires were September 7th or 9th, I think something like that. There is almost kind of a hauntingly familiar regular pattern to the way Westside fires burn. So this has some really important implications, because we know now that if there are fires just kind of skunking around under moderate conditions on the west side and it's late summer, that's when we need to have a heads up that if this wind event is forecast, which it was in 2020, with plenty of days notice, that we should really prepare for an event like what we just had. So to kind of recap that part, we tend to think of Westside forests based on their face value look, which is this green, lush, verdant, rich rainforest. But it's always good to keep in mind that they're born in kind of a violent event, which is just sort of paradoxical feeling. And one parallel I like to make is to the way we've kind of awakened to the earthquake risk in our region. For decades, earthquakes were really considered kind of a California problem, right? And that the Northwest, we didn't really have that. Only recently have we come to appreciate that actually we do have earthquakes. They're way less frequent than California's, but they're actually more destructive when they occur. And we're having, I think, a similar awakening to fires on the west side. So actually before last year, I had termed these fires Cascadia subduction fires to sort of draw the parallels with the earthquakes we get over here. And what I wanted to emphasize, this is funny too, because before last year, it was hard to convince people that this was also a modern era possibility. Like, oh, sure, it happened in history, but it couldn't happen now. But what we were sort of telling folks, this is not just a historical way that these landscapes behaved. It is an inherent wiring in the DNA of these landscapes. This is the way they work. And so when these fires occur now, it's not just because of climate change, and it's not necessarily due to forest mismanagement, which I'll talk about more in a minute. And like I say, these big events are just kind of wired into the system. And knowing that, that means that there must be a built-in resilience to those events that seem extremely catastrophic to us and are catastrophic to our communities, but are pretty much business as usual for these landscapes themselves. So yeah, this topic of like, could these happen today? So it's a little easier to convince people of that now in the last few months. But it's worth kind of still looking into some of these things, how the modern landscape and era differs from the historical era. What about fire suppression? What about modern infrastructure? What about fuels management? Talking about fire suppression, we do have a modern and very effective fire suppression sort of complex now, and it does a very good job at some things. And speaking from direct experience, there are some conditions under which, even the top technology and top crews and top amount of resources thrown at something can't get in the way When a fire is driven by 50-mile-an-hour winds through the level of fuels and biomass that the productive Westside has, there's really only one thing that firefighting crews can do, and that is get out of the way. So it's sort of like trying to stop a Category 5 hurricane. You know, it's just not going to happen. It's a force of nature. Right, driven by these synoptic east winds. So during a wind event, fire suppression really isn't really a factor. What about modern infrastructure? We've got networks of roads out in the landscape. We've got fuel breaks. There's highways. And yes, those can make a difference under moderate condition fires. But again, with wind-driven event fires, so in California, the recent fires like I think the Paradise and Camp fires, those recent ones jumped 10-lane freeways, which is probably the best fuel break we could ever come up with. And then even the Eagle Creek fire jumped the Columbia River, which is pretty impressive. And that actually wasn't that strongly of a wind-driven event. And then the 1988 fires in Yellowstone National Park jumped the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, which is like a mile-wide landscape feature. So it's worth appreciating that there's some event types that modern infrastructure really doesn't necessarily stop. And what about fuels management? This is actually, I'm sure if those of you have been following the Westside fires thing and what caused them have probably heard or read things about this. And one thing to appreciate about the Westside is, remember how I explained how the east side is kind of fuel limited because it's not very productive, it's dry, it's not dense biomass wise. Totally different on the Westside. These are some of the, if not the most productive forest landscapes on the planet. And they are just full of vegetation biomass. And when they're cleared or disturbed, they fill in very quickly. And what I'm showing there is a sequence of all the different kind of stages of forest age, from the youngest forest after disturbance to managed forest plantations, through mature forest to old growth forests. And you can appreciate that none of those are really limiting to fire spread. Any of those readily carry fire. So we have to kind of get out of a fuels management mindset on the Westside. And actually going back to that, if we were to take kind of an east side toolbox perspective and try to thin these forests down or reduce fuels like we do in dry forests, we would have to transform these forests into something unrecognizable. It'd be sort of like trying to take the stripes off a tiger. We would sort of have to pave them probably to be effective, because A, we would transform them into something different, and B, they would grow back so fast that we could likely never keep up with the biomass growth, which we can't even do with the resources we have in dry forests very well. So the fuel management approach is really not as relevant on most of the Westside. How about looking into the future with climate change? Let's go back to our 3 factors. So how are these going to change in the future? Exceptional summer drought. There's pretty good evidence that is going to increase. In fact, we're already seeing that. You notice that I've described the necessary summer drought condition as exceptional, yet I've cited 2 examples of it in the last 6 years. Meaning we're getting more and more of what we call exceptional summer drought that's becoming less exceptional. And what that means is that we're effectively loading the dice a bit for fire on the Westside by setting the stage. That the drought is what sets the stage to make the rest of the recipe possible. So there is that. As far as ignition sources, this is an interesting plot showing what causes fires, literally the fire starts on in Western Washington. It's the same in Oregon. Orange is lightning started fires, and the blue is human caused fires. You can see that about 95% of fires are caused by humans, actually. So under natural conditions, ignitions are actually pretty rare on the Westside, whereas actually we are starting quite a few fires there. And what that means is that, combined with population increase that we know is happening and will continue to happen over the next several decades, is more people in the mountains and more people having campfires and flicking cigarettes out the windows and so on. So that factor will probably also increase. However, none of that really would matter too much for the largest fires if the east wind events, if the frequency of those doesn't change. And that remains a question mark. And if anything, it's actually possible that those events, preliminary analysis, we're working on a study on this, as are some other groups, that those events are likely to stay flat or possibly even decrease in frequency. So the jury's out, and it's not necessarily doomsday. It's just, yeah, it's a complex equation that, that wind event is hard to predict, on a weekly scale, much less, several decades out. So that was some broader context of things we know about Westside fires, kind of place the 2020 fires in that context. And now I want to talk specifically about last year's fires. Were they unprecedented in scale? I hope I've convinced you, like back to this slide, that last year's fires fall pretty well in line actually with what we expected to happen and what appears to have happened in the past. And actually, interestingly, again, here's that map of the settlement era fires that were mapped and just kind of translated into a blue color. And if we map the 2020 fires onto those, there's reasonable correspondence in terms of the fires actually happening in similar areas, similar watersheds. Some of the work we're doing now is looking into whether there are hotspots on the west side that tend to experience fires, these large fires, more frequently than other spots. And it does look like the Northwest Oregon area around Santiam, river drainages, parts of the Oregon Coast Range, and Southwest Washington are kind of the hotspots. Again, preliminary, but anyway, consistent with another line of historical evidence. So I've alluded to this a bit, this next question: were the 2020 fires caused by forest mismanagement or fuels mismanagement? And this one really gets levied in both directions. That the forests weren't managed enough, that we needed to have more active forest management to reduce fuels, to change forest structure, that we could have avoided these fires if we had done that. And conversely, on the other side, no, we've converted too much of the landscape to plantations. Plantations are the problem, and they caused the 2020 fires. And neither of those are true, because like I said, none of the stages of forest stand development on the west side are fuel limited. All of the stands are biomass rich. All of them can carry fire. And on the left side there is the west side example of that diagram I showed you at the beginning for east side forest, but this is now for west side. That if you let a forest grow on the west side for 300 or 400 years with fire suppression or without fire suppression, the forest will look the same because fires are rare anyway. Really be skeptical when you hear kind of the finger pointing that forest management of one flavor or the other was a big driver of the West Side fires. And actually, we're putting some data to this now, and so are some other groups, asking, okay, what forest age classes were there in these burn footprints, and how did each of those burn in terms of severity? Like, did one age of forest burn more severely than the other? Or did it burn, was it more likely to just carry the fire than the other? And the answer to both of those appears to be no. And it also appears to be, if anything, the plantations carry fire possibly a little bit better. But again, when the fires are driven by 50-mile-an-hour winds, that fire's going to do what it wants with all these stages. And another one is, we still read this a lot, and I don't imagine this is going to go away anytime soon, but there's really a mindset to, can't we apply the things we know how to manage for fire hazard and fuel hazard from the east side on the west side? Can't we thin the forest? Can't we make fuel breaks? The answer to that is, on a broad scale, really no. Because like what I told you before, you would have to transform these landscapes into something unrecognizable, and you would probably never be able to keep up with the fuel regrowth. And when you're dealing with fires that tend to be driven by hurricane force winds, just about, it's worth remembering these kinds of lessons. This is actually from one of the California fires, from an LA Times article. This is actually a thermal image of the fire burning, and it says it right here, burning, a blizzard of embers flew over the fuel breaks as if they didn't exist, which really kind of stuck with me. A blizzard of embers is quite the turn of phrase, but also just how ineffectual the fuel breaks were. This town around Paradise had actually done everything right. They had created a series of fuel breaks. They had done defensible space around their homes. But again, they were faced with a wind-driven fire event that really just wasn't responsive to any of that. Was it climate change? So this is also something you read in the papers and the popular press. This is a symptom of climate change. Like I said before, climate change is a factor for Westside fires in that it appears it will set the stage more often for fires to occur on the west side. But it's not a necessary prerequisite, because I'll keep this simple. They happened before there was anthropogenic climate change, which means you didn't need climate change for this event to occur. Whether this one occurred because of climate change, was this a drought year because of that, and it wouldn't have been otherwise, is virtually impossible to know. Just like it's impossible to say that any given single hurricane is a result of climate change. Another one is, will the forest recover? This is going to be a debate in Oregon for some years now. I'm sure it already is. There's varying perspectives on the degree to which we need to go in and manipulate the stands in some way, or replant them, or salvage log them to, I don't know, sort of reset the system. And it's important to keep in mind, again, that these forests have been burning through cycles of this for millennia. And these are just some examples from the first 5 years. This is kind of that devastated looking moonscape to our eye in the first year post-fire on a fire that we're studying near Mount Rainier. In 3 years, it's greened up pretty well. And in 5 years, it actually gets hard to walk around because of the amount of vegetation growth. So there is that. And then in terms of salvage logging for the to reduce the fire hazard, that kind of thing can be important around infrastructure, just like defensible space can still be, and fuel treatments can be important around housing communities, towns, infrastructure like electrical equipment, any of that sort of thing. But over a large landscape scale, it's good to appreciate that these stands, being west side productive systems, will carry fire if there's an ignition and a wind event in the next 20, 30, or however many years. And no amount of removing snags is really going to fundamentally alter that. So it's good to keep in mind. We can, of course, salvage, there's huge amounts of private land that had investments of timber growing there that was like 40 years worth of revenue standing on the ground, and they need to recover that for their business models. Totally different question. I'm talking about from the perspective of ecosystem recovery, how necessary that is. So yeah, my talk's been sort of a little bit doomsday, but now I have 2020 to back me up that this is all actually true. And so we get this sort of like, what do we do about this? The way we like to convey this is to think about Westside fires as having two different flavors. And one is these huge wind-driven events that I've talked about. And really what we need to do for those is a disaster preparedness mindset. And we need to have good evacuation plans, and we need to be ready to get out of the way. And to the extent we can, harden our infrastructure to those events. But I would argue that was one of the main ways we were unprepared for last year's fires, is that we weren't prepared to get out of the way fast enough. And then the second flavor of fires, we do get these on the west side that we call them moderate condition events. It's all the ingredients are there except the big giant synoptic east wind event. We might get mild east winds like we had on the Eagle Creek fire or some other recent fires we've had. but those tend to not blow up quite as much. And for those, some of the fuel and hazard mitigation stuff that we tend to adopt from the east side can have more relevance, especially around infrastructure. Oh, and the other one is, whereas on the east side, fire suppression has been appropriately demonized as causing so many problems by letting the forest densify so badly and contributing to a fuel problem. On the west side, fire is so infrequent naturally that there's actually very little harm in suppressing fires there, because these forests don't really need frequent fire to maintain their sort of structure and function like east side forests do. And so by suppressing a single fire when it's small, we might buy ourselves another 50 or even 100 years until the next one, with very little consequence for the ecosystem in terms of its structure and its function. So we actually make a case that if you're going to suppress fires, the west side is actually a good place to concentrate that effort and to kind of nip them in the bud while they're small, before that east wind event kicks up. So takeaways for west side fires is to really remember just how productive these systems are, which means that fuels are always really abundant there. And really, it's all about the climate and weather that drives the big fire events here. And when you hear, cases made that it's because of forest management or other things, then be really skeptical of that, because we're really talking about a larger force of nature here. And that we need to think beyond kind of our fuel management mindset that we bring from the east side. And then to think of these two flavors of west side fire where we can mitigate the effects of kind of those moderate condition events, but really we can only prepare kind of in a disaster preparedness kind of way for these extreme events. And I'm kind of hoping that 2020 was that wake-up call where we're actually maybe going to take that action. And I think that's all I have. So I'm happy to field questions and whatnot.
Great talk, Dan. We got a couple of questions on the chat. You can read them, or we can let people chip in and ask themselves. I think Jacqueline had the first question to everyone, which was, how is climate change impacting the 100-year cycles you made reference to?
How is climate change? What was that?
Impacting the 100-year cycles you made reference to. I think that was asked a little before you got into the climate question, but.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, short-ish answer. It's actually it's a difficult question. It's a good question. I mean, yeah, I touched on it in the talk. We don't know how it's going to affect the frequency of those large events because the winds are so uncertain. But we do think that it's likely to increase the frequency of the moderate events, because all you need for those really is the summer drought and an ignition. And if we're going to get more frequent or deeper summer drought and longer fire seasons on the west side, then that just means we're kind of tilting the dice to getting more of those moderate events. So that means that 100-year frequency or something like that is likely to come down and be, I can't put a number on it yet. I don't want to speculate. Some of the literature on that, some of the projections suggest that fires might become 4 or 5 times more frequent on the west side over the next century. But the thing to appreciate is that fires are already really pretty infrequent. So you're multiplying a very small number by 4 or 5. So it sounds like a lot, but and it could be a significant change, but keep that in mind. Can you read me the other ones? I actually can't see.
Yes. So from Monica Schaefer, what sort of support or resistance to your research findings are you getting from politicians in the affected and potentially affected areas?
Yeah, lots. I'm used to that. Let's see. It's still hard to convince people about the sort of natural force nature of these events, and that there's only so much you can do. People don't love to hear that naturally, it helps when we sort of tell people that there are these moderate condition events that you still can do some things for. I think the disaster preparedness message is still not quite landing enough. And let's see, what else? Fire suppression. Most people can totally get behind fire suppression. They think it's great. So, which is usually anathema to say as a fire ecologist, but so that's been kind of interesting. And we actually expected to get a lot of blowback from other fire ecologists because it's really considered antithetical to everything that fire ecologists subscribe to say that you should suppress fires. But actually, the reception's been like, oh yeah, I guess that makes sense in that landscape. And then the post-fire logging debate will not change, has not changed for 20 years. Still the same arguments being made in both directions. And yeah, I don't expect that debate to change, but there is not a not uncommon mindset that the forest won't recover basically without the help of white people, to put it bluntly. That, you know, kind of flying in the face of the millennia of cycling of forest generations that have clearly happened in the past, but only so many times you can say that message.
I take it you still can't see the messages, is that correct?
Correct.
So Mark McLaughlin, our chairman, is asking, how might the prescribed burning of forest land by tribes, native folks, have had an effect on the 500-year fire cycle of Westside forests?
Great question. Yeah. So yes, Native Americans were present on the West Side, of course, and they used prescribed fire. As far as we know, that tended to occur more frequently in the lower elevation areas around settlements and travel routes, which tended to be in the drier forests like the Puget Trough and the Willamette Valley, and then up some of the river valleys. And it's also perfectly likely that some of those fires made it up into the mountains, and some of them may have occurred and gotten caught by an east wind event. It's also quite possible that the natives were savvy about east wind events. They knew about a lot of things, and so they may have avoided late summer burning for that reason. We don't know these things, at least I don't, I should say. However, to get to your question, the 500-year fire rotation estimates do incorporate Native American burning in them. So those are based on when we go to forest landscapes and we core trees and we age stands to find out how old a forest stand is. And then we map those forest stand ages across the landscape. And from that, you can do some calculations to say, okay, this is how frequent apparently forests were reset by fire based on the age distribution that's out there. And that age distribution reflected whatever was causing fires over the past, say, 500-600 years when before we started collecting data in forests here. And so that includes both lightning caused fires and Native American caused fires to whatever degree they were contributing.
Great. Nadine, Neil comments, great slides, very informative. Thank you for your time and expertise. Peter Hayes asks, what should be the top priorities for future research?
Oh, well, I mean, I think we need to solve the $64 million question about what the east wind events are going to do in the future, because that really is going to affect how we approach and manage the risk of those, is understanding how frequently that's likely to occur. What are some of the other ones? One thing we need to get a better handle on is we have some evidence from the historical record that young forests tend to reburn pretty frequently. So like the Yakult burn in 1902 in Southwest Washington experienced a couple reburns. The Tillamook burn is famous. That's where the term 6-year jinx was coined, because the Tillamook burn reburned 3 different times, every time at a 6-year interval. So we think that there are now portions of the West Side that, because 1 million acres of it burned last summer, are going to maybe primed for more burning in the next few decades. Maybe because the microclimate there is drier and more open and windy and just more exposed. We have some hypotheses, but we're looking into that. We're also delving into just more of the historical fire record, trying to get a better handle on some of those uncertainties that I told you about, well, we think the fire rotation is this, and we think fires occurred this often, and we think fires were this big, but we're trying to look at old burn footprints and get some better handle on that. But yeah, it's hard to not say climate change is right at the top of the list in terms of what impacts it's going to have.
And a comment from Gufstein, I'm not sure I got your name right. Thanks. You made it especially clear that letting the Beachy Creek fire burn with a possible wind forecast was likely a huge error.
Yeah, I can't remember the origin of that one. I mean, there may have been a period where that fire was burning prior to the east wind event kicking up, maybe, and they let it burn. I'm not sure if that was one of those. I think there was one.
Is this the fire behind Tillamook or down towards Lincoln City, or was that was Beachy was on the Cascades?
Yeah, Beaches in the Cascades near the Warm Springs and Upper Santiam
Okay.
drainages, I believe. And that may be one that was a holdover that I'm not sure. Yeah, I can't speak to whether they let it burn or they just hadn't put it out yet. I'm not sure. But yeah, in that case, it's a good example of if you want to mitigate that risk is not letting Westside fires skunk around in late summer, because if that east wind event kicks up, off it goes.
Yeah, my comment on that is if we have resources at the state scale and we're spending them on the east side, and we're having a small Westside fire pop up, you know, it begs the question. So there's a salient comment.
Totally. Yep. And when it's an exceptional summer drought year, when the big Westside fire event, when the stage is set for it, guess where all our firefighting resources are?
East side.
The east side, because they're also having the big drought event. And
Yep.
so that is one thing we've been trying to relay is like, we need to keep some resources on the west side to get them while they're small in late summer.
Yep. And the other question is, do we have enough resources to put out all the fires in a timely fashion? And sounds like maybe no in some cases.
Right. I mean, you look at the numbers on those graphs of the number of human caused ignitions. I mean, it's hard to keep up with, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Regarding the Tillamook burn, this is from Eden McCall. I've read the snags were like tinder and then the reburns killed any potential seeds and thus needed replanting. Do you have any thoughts on the Tillamook regeneration reburning and replanting forests to reduce fire risk?
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I love that the Tillamook burn is commonly brought up as an example of the reburn problem and the snag contribution to the reburn. So the thing to know about the Tillamook reburns that few people appreciate is that all of them were caused by post-fire logging operations that were removing snags. So there's a little bit of circular irony there. That the very activity that they were taking to reduce the fire hazard is itself what caused the reburns. So the degree to which, that was really that much of a risk, like I say, that's a major research question. And we have some evidence that it might be. But the Tillamook burn isn't the greatest example to cite for that because of that. Also, the vegetation is really what carries fire for the most part on the west side, just because it's so dense. And whether there are snags in that vegetation, you can, if you're looking at a sea of continuous fuels, then whether there are snags there probably won't change whether that site will burn. And killing reprod is very easy. In a young stand, you do not need a hot fire fueled by a hot snag, large fuels to kill reprod. All you need is any fire at all, because those young trees are very fire sensitive. So there's actually really flimsy evidence, really scant evidence that snag removal is a prerequisite for forest reestablishment. Like I say, there are plenty of reasons to do post-fire logging, especially economic or social or safety or aesthetic or whatever. But in terms of getting a stand reestablished and the reburn question, on the west side, especially, again, on the west side, it's not as relevant.
I'm going to jump in and ask, do you think that your work down in the Biscuit low those many years ago, finding higher fuel post-salvage versus unsalvaged would be relevant to west side burn landscapes?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it has relevance, no doubt. It's a similar, the Siskiyous are a little different because they're drier and more fire prone, but they are also similar in terms of being really high biomass and also being a system in which young forest stands are dominated by live fuels. The fuel profile is dominated by live vegetation. That's really what carries fire. So the basic principles of what we found there, which is if you drop the snags, it will create a larger pulse of the branches and treetops than you would typically get under natural dynamics. It will eventually reduce the amount of large fuels that accumulate there, right? At, say several decades out, because you're removing some of the large fuels. So yeah, that's another part of that equation. And actually the other research from the the Klamath-Siskiyou that I wasn't involved in, where they looked at the biscuit fire and how it reburned areas of a prior fire that burned 15 years earlier. Showed that I think it was the salvage and planted areas burned a little more severely than the unsalvaged areas. No one was really quite sure exactly why, but what I took away from that is that you can't really salvage and plant your way out of the reburn risk.
Yeah, and if live vegetation is carrying fire, those replanted areas are probably carrying higher live biomass and a little more of it because they got going a little quicker.
Yeah, well, and what they have is the dense conifers, which are geometrically perfect in terms of carrying, fuel bed. So
So okay, excellent presentation from Linda Brown. Tri Govstein came back and said that, the fire that referred to the Beachy, I think, was above Opal Creek Education Center. They let it burn in the wilderness. It was let burn in a wilderness, and so that was possibly a factor in them stepping back from that and not doing immediate suppression. And I'm really intrigued. The takeaway, I've kind of had my thinking overly influenced by Eastside fires, but really your point is a good one, that you just don't really have room for tolerating Westside fires, particularly if you have a wind coming, if you can put them out.
Right. Yeah, and
if you're fighting a fire in the Strawberries and you're the state and you've got one in the Cascades, you need to be over in the Cascades.
The Cascades is the one where you, by a little action at the start, you could make 100,000 acre difference.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And Jacqueline, to everyone, what about more research on the impact of monoculture plantations? Most experts I hear support the premise they speed up fire spread.
Right. There are several groups looking at that. We're taking kind of a look at that, but it's such a hot button topic. It's like, do you really want to get into that? But yes, there are groups looking at that, and from the initial results I've seen, the young plantations tended to carry fire every bit as well, and if not slightly more readily than older forests. Which, yeah, it's a very continuous fuel bed, right? I mean, it's managed to be a dense wood producing landscape, so it's pretty continuous fuel. So it would be really surprising to me if those didn't carry fire well. How could they not? There's continuous fuel.
Yeah. I remember asking Mike Newton at a big conclave after the B&B fire, and he had given a talk about the importance of intensive early management and sort of a forest management from his perspective for particularly for producing commodity values. And he had a couple of slides, and one of the slides showed a tan oak stand with a single Doug-fir coming out of it over a large area. And it was a 50-year-old stand, and the Doug-fir was about 10 years tall, or 10 feet tall, 20 feet tall, and it was just getting out of the tan oak. And he had another stand that was a beautiful, even-aged, intensively managed Douglas fir stand. And my question was, which one of those stands is liable to have a live Doug-fir after a high-intensity fire passes through? And Mike answered, and Mike is one of the architects of intensive commercial forestry in Western Oregon, and a great guy. And I'm a friend, a buddy of mine. I consider him a friend. And he said, well, the tan oak stand would have more likely to have a live Doug-fir in there. But it certainly doesn't fit in terms of most commercial industrial forest models, because you're not growing any trees there to speak of.
Right, exactly.
But it particularly, you get an outside of this part of the west side, that it can introduce a little resilience in the landscape to have less intensive managed parts of the landscape potentially.
Yeah, exactly. And I think last year was a bit of a wake up call that, because a lot of the reaction I would get to this talk before last year was, well, but now we've got it all in these nice plantations. They're not going to end with roads, and they're not going to carry fire and so on. And now at least I think a lot of those private landowners, the warehousers and whatnot, now I think they understand that they need to factor in this risk into their business model.
Yeah. I think some of the smaller, medium private land managers got bit pretty hard. You have to be pretty big to self-insure from those kinds of losses. So
right. Or have the infrastructure to go log, 60,000 acres at once before it rots.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
So I think that's the end of the questions. If anyone has any more questions or input, this is a good time.
Yeah. Hi, Dan. Thanks for such an informative and enlightening presentation. Really, really great data that you shared with us. So I had a follow-up question actually on mine about the prescribed burns of native tribes. And you referenced that from the age cores that you were able to get. It just made me think about when that data was actually collected. You know, if it was collected post settlement, then there might not have been many older big stands left. So to get those age classifications that you can map out, I'm just curious, yeah, how that data was obtained in the first place.
Yeah, good question. I actually collected very little of that. It was mostly collected before my time as a scientist. It was collected in landscapes that were dominated by natural origin forests, actually. So they did a lot of work in Mount Rainier National Park. They did a lot of work in the North Cascades, and there were pretty wild landscapes. They did a lot of that work in places that were they had experienced their first entry clear cut, like in the mid 70s or 80s, and the stumps, they could count the rings on the stumps. So even though that was a managed landscape, they could still reconstruct the old forest that had been there that was cut. So that's how virtually all of the fire history studies on the west side were done, is using kind of natural origin forests and mapping out the ages of those to try and like you say, get past the sort of settlement and European, post-European management influence, if that makes sense. And then, and yeah, because of how the longevity of forests here, that means they could look back in time, typically, 200 to 500 or 600 years or more, actually, in some landscapes, because that's how old the forests were at the time. So it could paint a decent picture over the last, half a millennium or so.
Try Gilstein also commented, short rotations spend most of their time with low value trees that go through a fire. Why not go to longer rotations so there's value left after a fire? It seems to be financially prudent to do the long rotations for commercial forests. You're welcome to take that. I'm hoping that we have some of our board members here who actually work for commercial land managers. Go ahead if one of those guys wants to step in, I'd encourage them to. And Dan, you have any comments? Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point, and that's actually a really important issue right now. There are some very convincing reasons, actually, and they're becoming more so to make a case for longer rotation forestry than is practiced on a lot of private lands. It actually has some carbon and climate benefits. It actually produces more wood volume over time from a production standpoint. And you also have, on average, an older forest landscape, which can provide for some more ecosystem values. So there's some good arguments for that. The main argument against it, actually, or the reason why the industry has moved away from it, is something called net present value. It's a nerdy concept, an economic concept that it's outside my expertise, but it discounts future value versus present value. And I shouldn't really speak any more to that, other than to say that economic model kind of drives the rotation down. That's the one driver that makes the short, like 35 to 40 year rotations make the most economic sense for like stakeholders. But from a forestry standpoint and a lot of other ecosystem management standpoint, longer rotations make a lot of sense.
I'm going to comment on that from what I remember from taking forest economics from Norm Johnson back in the day, and basic forest management, which was that, it's easy to think about it, it's just kind of a reverse mortgage on your house. When you're looking at a freshly harvested forest and you go and invest in that site prep, perhaps herbicides, planning, the clock's running on the opportunity cost on that money. So you need to be thinking about paying yourself interest on that money. And so even at 3 or 4%, the cost of your investment cost at the front end of that forest management exercise get very high. And if you compound them, they get very high out at 40 and 50 years. And so from sort of a rational value standpoint, which is driven by companies managing who have a fiduciary responsibility to their stockholders, short rotations look good. I'm not familiar with what you just described, but I remember, the old story that I remember hearing.
Right.
So let's see. Peter Hayes, there are wilderness areas along and west of the Cascade Crest. Is there any chance that they would start fighting fires on the west side in the wilderness? Let's see. or wilderness areas along and west of the Cascade Crest? Is there any chance that they would, do you think people will start fighting fires in wilderness areas after, let's say your research really lands?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think actually they can already do that, and
Okay.
that they do sometimes. It's harder. I mean, you have to basically like send in a remote crew, like smoke jumping or heliTAC or something,
Yeah.
So it's more resource intensive and harder to get to. And when resources are stretched thin, they can't get to them. But
Right.
I don't think there's a prohibition on it. And I remember when my first year of firefighting, we were in a wilderness area. And actually we had to go in after the fire was controlled and go and roughen up the chainsaw cut edges we had done, because it leaves too much of a human looking footprint, look aesthetic. So we had to go in with axes and make the cuts look all rough and natural.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, that's my anecdote for I think wilderness firefighting is allowed. It's just harder to do.
Interesting. Well, it looks like questions are winding down. Any more input or questions?
Is it possible just to ask one?
Go right ahead.
Yeah, my thinking on basically most of the life of short rotation plantations is spent with 100% risk of losing everything when there's a fire for the first 30 years. And you've got only a very short period when you have something financially viable. On the other hand, in an 80-year rotation, the period of vulnerability to a total loss is a much smaller fraction of the life of that forest. And so while you have that time value of money in that basic calculation, if you add to it an appropriate recognition of fire risk and the risk of a total loss, because there's nothing to salvage in these young plantations. An 80-year-old forest that burns still has most of the value of the logs left behind after the fire. That's the essence of my thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could be another argument for long rotations. Yeah, I want to digest that one a bit.
Yeah, and the thing is, as you very appropriately stated, longer rotations give more adequate time for the soil to recover, for biodiversity to be reestablished. The watersheds begin to recover more adequately. So if you're dealing with a drinking water watershed, that longer rotation has a huge value for the water yield. To say nothing of the fact that those older trees are a much better contributor to sequestering carbon dioxide in relation to climate change. So it's just basically fire risk adds yet another, to me, very strong argument of supporting pressing for longer rotations. Thank you for listening, because that was too much to try to write.
Right.
Thanks for your comments. Any questions?
Oh,
Will, looks like another one popped in the chat there.
Okay. Eden McCall, if increasing suppression is necessary on the west side, do you think increasing roads will have a net benefit, like logging roads, despite causing other forest disturbances?
That one is a complex equation, actually, because with roads come people, and with people come ignitions. So there's a trade-off there. So yeah, it could increase access for firefighting, which would probably help suppression efforts, but there would probably be more fires to suppress and some higher risk incurred by that. So I don't quite know the answer to that question.
Mm-hmm. Good question. Well, I think we're kind of winding down here.
All right.
Dan, thanks so much for your talk. It was just absolutely fantastic. And it was really nice to have some of my assumptions about these things challenged and sorted out. So I appreciate it.
Nice. That was my first opportunity to update this after the 2020 fire. So that was good.
Yeah, good.
All right.
All righty. And Try Gavestein commented, by the way, my background is the gorge fire. So.
Oh, nice. Yeah, it looks like it. I get it. Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks so much for showing up and everyone's comments and being here. And don't forget to support the council and get involved if you wish to. We'd love to have your help.
Cool.
And Dan, next time you're down this neck of the woods, I owe you supper because I told you if you gave a talk, I'd feed you a nice dinner. And you're in Washington with COVID, so perhaps we'll get you down here and we can get that sorted out.
Cool. Let's do it. Sounds good.
All right.
And thanks again, Dan. I was gonna ask, and this is something you don't have to answer now, but as watershed councils, we're looking at ways to try and include some silviculture practices into our restoration work. And so just curious, as a watershed council, we haven't really thought about fires, right? Until 2020. It just wasn't really in our purview. And so now, we've already had talks about it as a council. And so just curious, from your standpoint, what you might recommend watershed councils do when we're involved and we're partnering with groups to try and restore some of these watersheds, how we might include potential best practices for management in potentially our silviculture practices.
Okay. Yeah, that's a huge question. I'll need some time to digest that one.
Okay.
Right. I'll make this. I'm not speaking for the council. I'm speaking for myself. If I've been kind of following and a little bit involved in the science of how wood and sediment gets delivered to channels, which is really, really important to our fish habitat. And a lot of them are rather poor in particularly the steeper channels in sediment and wood that is really key for fish habitat. My biggest concern in a landscape fire here for the fish isn't the 5 years after the fire, it's how much big wood's around to be delivered in landslides to the watershed, because the landslides that happen after a fire are one of the best habitat restoration projects we could have for coho. Not that we want to see our watershed burned. It would be devastating to many stakeholders and dangerous, but there's a lot of science that supports the idea that those natural processes are what generates good fish habitat over time. And if we have healthy fish populations, they're quite resilient and deal with the 1 to 5 year hit that can occur when watersheds get busy, if you will. Gordy Reeves said after the 96 floods that he thought the 96 floods and the landslides were the best coho restorations project you could have. And he's one of the that. Yeah, and he's one of the people who knows most about coho habitat in the region. So I thought that was interesting. So
yeah.
All right. On that note.
All right.
Yeah. Fish have evolved with those, cyclical large disturbances. What they're not used to is death by a million cuts.
Correct.
Chronic. Yep.
Yeah. We want diverse functioning populations accessing a lot of diverse habitats if and when these fires happen. So.
Right.
So.
Cool.
Well, thanks again, Dan. Appreciate you enlightening us and informing us about these topics. So thanks again for a wonderful talk. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Dan. Good night.
And thanks for hosting, Will. You did great.
Thank you for everyone's help and support on this. And I hope I went smoothly enough.
Very smoothly, and thank you, Dan.
Yep.
Yes.
Thanks for listening.
All right. I'm going to stop recording now. Good night, everyone.
Bye.